The following two lectures are primarily about the evangelization efforts of the 16th and into the 17th century. I will be first turning our attention to the Western missions, particularly in Central and South America, and then in the subsequent lecture we will turn our attention to Africa, India, Japan, and China. I will not be going and talking about all of these missions in great details. I'm also missing places and where there are evangelization efforts. The amount of activity, missionary activity in the 16th and 17th century is nearly mind-boggling, and you could spend a lifetime studying it. My goal in these two lectures is to at least present you with kind of a basic narrative of these missions and the emerging deeper conversations that come from these attitudes about how to present the gospel to a different people, to a people who are non-European, who have never experienced the world in a European way, how to give to them Christianity. And two models will emerge, as we'll talk about, although they're not rigid monolithic models, but you can say that there are two overall patterns which emerge. And for a lack of a better term, I will call the one model the Iberian model, which is to teach the natives to be European as part of the process of Christianization. And the other part, for lack of a better term, I will call the Jesuit model, particularly the Italian Jesuit model, which is to find ways to use existing cultural norms and structures in order to preach the gospel. So one is the path of, you could say, of indoctrination, and the other is the path of enculturation. And these two models will both be operative in this golden age of missionary activity in the church. As for the missionary activities in North America, I will have to leave that to Father Zielinski to cover in his course with you, and to leave you in the hands of Vidmar for the time being. The Catholic world was shrinking, so it seems, if we just pay attention to what we've been discussing so far in this course. The Protestants had taken away from most parts of Germany. They will subsequently be able to lay hold of Scandinavian countries as well. England and Scotland will fall to the Protestants, and there'll be, of course, the Protestants in Switzerland making inroads throughout the Holy Roman Empire and in parts of France. So in one way you could see is that the 16th century seems to be a collapse of the Catholic world, but that is to forget the most robust expansion of the faith that occurred starting from 1492 forward. The Catholic world of the 17th century is truly a global world, and it is in part due to the European movements and establishment of colonies throughout the world, but also trading settlements as well in the Far East besides just colonies. It is really kind of as Europe began to expand and to explore the globe for the sake of conquest and trade, so did the horizons of the Catholic Church vastly expand from the small world of Europe and the Mediterranean to now encompass the entirety of the world. Popes initially did not have much control over the missions. They had given it away to Portugal and Spain. The whole world was divided in two by Alexander VI at the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Basically, Spain would get the west and Portugal would get the east plus Brazil. This decision of handing over especially control of these foreign missions to the patronage of the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns was going to be a source of continued difficulty in the history of the missions, as the Spanish and the Portuguese sought to keep their monopoly over the missionary efforts, and this would lead to a frustration on the part of other efforts by the rest of the church to spread the gospel into these areas. So the Jesuits will be more active in the East initially than they will be in the West, mostly because the Jesuits were slowed down by the Inquisition in Spain and had a better start in Portugal. But the Jesuits and the friars will be our primary agents in missionary activity in the 16th and in the 17th centuries. The Protestants had no sense of missiology in our period. The Protestants really won't develop a missiology to speak of until the 19th century. You can see here this statement from the President of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in response to a suggestion that maybe we should spread the faith to these places where the British Empire is extending, and this is the answer. To spread abroad among barbarians and heathen natives the knowledge of the gospel seems to be highly preposterous, insofar as it anticipates and even reverses the order of nature. There is no missiology in that particular position. The Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith was established in 1622, and its goal is to have oversight and control of the missions, although it will fight from its very inception with the powers of patronage on the part of the European monarchs. But this document, this Instructio of 1649, with regard especially to China, has the Church's sort of official position. You could say that maybe this is Rome's position with regard to missions, but this particular vision will of course not be followed by all members of the Church, and certainly not by many of the agents within the territories of New Spain and other places controlled by Spain. You shall not attempt by any means to persuade these people to change their customs and habits, provided they are not clearly opposed to religion and righteousness. So let's stop there for a moment. Already we are seeing one of the major tensions that will exercise the history of the missions. What are these customs and habits that are acceptable or to religion? And there will be various answers on that, and that will feed into many of the disputes, particularly over the Chinese rites, as it will emerge later on. But as continuing, for nothing would be more unreasonable than to carry France, Spain, Italy, or any other European country to China. This is not your mission. What you should bring to them is the faith, a faith which does not despise or destroy the usages and customs of any land, but wishes to see them intact, provided that they are not bad. So the making people into Europeans in order so that they could be Christians is rejected here in this particular model. Those of us that have paid attention to the Second Vatican Council, this language, or the pontificate of John Paul II, all of this language resonates very clearly with us. The fact that Propaganda Fidei is saying it as a really intense instruction shows that there is a debate over the nature of this way of engagement with foreign cultures. You can read in the language here of the Instructio that there is clearly another voice that the Instructio is responding to. So the goal here is to use the local customs, use the local habits in order to spread the faith, so long as they are not bad. And that, of course, they are not bad is, of course, the major sticking point in this question. But this is kind of the official position of the Church. Another way of looking at the official position of the Church is in Sublimus Deus, where the Pope lays out very clearly that the natives are indeed people and they should not be terrorized and they should not be exploited, that they should be given the faith. So overall, the official Church's position is one that respects the new cultures, new people that are being met, and seeks to find a way to provide them the gospel in a way that accords with their habits and customs, so long as they are not bad. The beginning efforts of Central American missions began with the second voyage of Columbus. There are some clergy available on there, primarily brought for the settlers in the second voyage coming to the Caribbean. But the real efforts to spread the faith into Central America, into the Caribbean world, will come with the arrival of the friars. The Dominicans and the Franciscans will lead the charge into the New World. Of course, as they lead this charge into the New World, they will also be on the heels of the conquistadors. The friars first arrive into what was modern-day Haiti in 1510, and then the Dominicans will arrive in 1511. And it was in that year, in 1511, that we have a record of a fiery denunciation of the Spanish colonists by the leader of the friars, Antonio de Montesinos, who dies in 1545. He condemned their slavery, greed, and inhumane treatment of anything and everyone in their quest for riches. You can see when Columbus arrived, his discoveries, the people were to become vassals of the Spanish crown, and they were to be treated as vassals of the Spanish crown. But the colonists that accompanied Columbus, especially from his second voyage, had very different ideas about what to do with the natives, and they immediately moved on to conquering, exploitation, and enslaving of the natives. Columbus was a little bit more open to conquering the harsher tribes around that were terrorizing the people that he had met when he first arrived. But Columbus himself would fight robustly for the natives, and it's one of the reasons that the colonists would actually drive Columbus off and have him removed, and so that they could have a freer hand to do what they wanted to do. But this first denunciation by Antonio de Montesinos and the conflict with Columbus by the colonists with him as governor over native rights is just the opening salvo in a long and protracted fight in the Spanish world over the fate of the natives. The plight faced by the natives and those who wanted to save their souls is probably best summed up by the account of the execution of Chief Hatui, who tried to warn the tribes on the nearby island that is Cuba of these colonists, and he was captured and he was executed by burning at the stake. He was still asked, however, if he wanted to convert and go to heaven, and he asked, "Where are the Christians?" And they said they can be in heaven. And then he said he would rather go to hell than to see such a cruel people again or be near them. So the fate of Hatui is known because of the most important advocate of natives at this early stage in European colonization, which is Bartolomé de las Casas. And his brief account of the destruction of the Indies was sort of an Uncle Tom's Cabin book for native rights, native treatment in the Spanish-speaking world. So it became an instant bestseller, and it moved the needle in the Spanish court to eventually to come to the aid of the natives. It was a long and protracted fight, however. Most theologians would favoring a treatment of the natives as full human beings, but some theologians were supporting the idea that they were somehow lesser and born for slavery. Eventually, however, Bartolomé de las Casas and his position won out, and so the crown moved to institute greater controls over how the natives and their labor could be used. And this is the creation of the plantation system, the comunidad system, where only a number of the natives were allowed to be used for forced labors, and only for a limited number of months at that. And that if you were to do this to them, that the natives would need to be treated well, thoroughly catechized. And so really what happens here is that the crown tries to create this situation in which to defend the natives from colonial oppression, but what the colonialists just do is ignore it. So they obey but do not comply in this. And what can the crown do about it? Nothing. It's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So even though that this system was meant to help the natives, in the end it was impossible to enforce. So what we can see is that the Spanish crown, although convinced by the pro-native arguments from de las Casas and the Salamanca theologians, what we really begin to see emerge is that there are two competing choices in the early Spanish conquests of the New World, and that for the natives. One is pure exploitation on the part of many of the colonists, and the other is paternalism, a desire to take these people, to make them more civilized and help them in order to become fully Christian. Those are kind of your two choices that emerge at this time. What the Spanish did to the Aztec capital on a grand scale represents the typical pattern of Christianization throughout the regions that we would now think of as present-day Mexico. They destroyed the pagan sites and replaced them with churches. They tried to gather people together to live in villages based on a grid plan with a church in the middle. They rebaptized holy sites with shrines where they could. But on the whole, the Spanish were determined to exterminate all traces of the Aztec religion with its fierce, horrible gods and human sacrifice. And since so much of the Aztec culture was connected to religion, they destroyed much of the culture as well. Really, the idea here is that every trace of that religion needed to be exterminated. And while I do weep for the death of so many people within the Aztec Empire, I'm not sure I can weep for the destruction of those old and terrible gods. The natives would be encouraged or sometimes forced to live near cities. Initially, they would be baptized and then slowly Christianized. And this is the policy that you can see the friars following throughout New Spain and also in South America as well. It was an idea of a process of bringing people through the symbols and the rituals of the church slowly into a deeper appreciation of the faith. Get them to appreciate the symbols, baptize them, get them to appreciate the symbols, insert them into the sacramental life, and then slowly move them towards a more catechetical understanding of the faith. And also, as part of this, is to insert them into the moral code. This process of conversion began in earnest with the arrival of the Franciscan friars in 1524. Most notable is probably Toribio de Benavente, who, the poor one, who is an observant Franciscan, poor, holy, deeply impressive to the people of the former Aztec Empire. One thing that we can also say about the friar missionaries as they come to the New World and when they go to the East as well, is that the observant friars had an intensity about when they were going to plant Christianity in these new worlds, when they were going to preach the gospel to people that had never heard it before, to establish communities that did the gospel right. The goal of many of these observant friars was not to make these people Christian, it was to make them even better Christians than the Europeans ever had been. And so that intensity also factors into some of the thinking when it comes to spreading the faith to the natives in this period. The conversion in this area of the former Aztec Empire and in the Mayan Empire as well was slow. The native population would hold on to much of their old religion, and the friars, however, wanted a uniform religion, just as Spanish identity demanded. So frequently the friars would build a fortified convent and bring the people to live near them in these villages and teach them the faith and farming techniques and morality. The goal here really was also to protect the natives from exploitation by the colonists as well. So it's frequently the friars and other church personnel that are once again the advocates of natives and native rights in all of this. But certainly the first bishop of Mexico City, Juan de Zumarraga, who arrives in 1528, boasted of his temple smashing abilities and also his mass baptisms. Some claims that there were 10 million baptized in the area by 1550. The question, however, of the genuineness of the conversion on the part of the people would plague the missionaries. In particular, Diego de Landa, a Franciscan provincial for the Yucatan, so in the former Mayan territory, he was exemplary in defending the natives from the colonists. But in 1562, it was discovered that some were still practicing idol worship, and even some signs that they were practicing human sacrifice still. This betrayal led to Diego launching an intense persecution with aid of an ad hoc inquisition, applying especially the penalty, the post-conviction penalties of hanging people by their wrists for an extended period of time as a form of punishment. So intense was this former champion of the natives' persecution of the natives with the ad hoc inquisition that the colonists actually appealed to the crown to have Diego to be removed. But the setback in the conversions in the Yucatan and Diego's intensity of his response shows one of the central tensions within the Iberian missions is this tension between the Spanish tradition of pure blood laws to keep the faith and the nation pure, and this deep suspicion of converts, such as dating back to the conversos of the early period in Spanish history, the conversos from the Moors and from the Jews. So these cultural contexts are part of the reasoning why the slowness on the part of the Spanish church in the New World to establish native clergy or to have a better approachment with the natives. It really is more of a paternalistic position, a slowly drawing people into Christianity while holding on to the more formal applications of Christianity, especially in terms of the priesthood. This restriction on native clergy won't be lifted until the 18th century. But the other burning issue of the genuineness of the conversion will continue to plague the church, not in the New World, not just in Mexico, not just in the Yucatan Peninsula, but all the way through even down into the remnants of the Incan Empire. One of the big questions in the conversion, especially in the Aztec, Mayan, and Incan territories, was the conversion genuine? So there were some symbols that the natives seemed to get instantly excited about, and one of them was St. James and the Moor Slayer image, which the Spanish and the Portuguese were both very fond of, and so it was often an image of St. James on a white horse. It turned out that it wasn't the saint that the natives were excited about and were venerating, but it turns out it was the white horse, which was similar to one of the gods that they had worshipped. And so while the friars were thinking that they were drawing people in through symbols, it turns out that it was syncretic. It was St. James plus their old god, rather than drawing them to the faith through symbols. So there are examples of syncretism in this, but there were also plenty of examples of genuine conversion and merging of the cultures, and that's best demonstrated, of course, by Our Lady of Guadalupe, who comes to an Aztec to speak to a Spanish bishop, is about reconciling the Aztec with the Spanish, and her imagery, while thoroughly European, is also very much borrowing from Aztec imagery as well. And her manifestation in the New World in 1531, drawing powerfully from both traditions, was one of the principal factors in the conversion of the area that we now think of in terms of Mexico. But there's always this kind of fear that the conversions aren't genuine on the part of many of the missionaries in New Spain in particular, and because of that the Inquisition would be used to check in on their faith, just like the Inquisition had been used to check in on the faith of the conversos in Spain back in the Old World. One of the results of the widespread death and mortality due to European diseases impacting natives of the New World was a complete lack of labor for farms and for these plantations that were established by the colonials. And in order to replace their labor, the European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, increased their trafficking in the sub-Saharan African slave trade. African slaves were brought in to take the place of the natives who had died, and this begins the long and torturous history of the sub-Saharan African diaspora. Popes condemned the slave trade in various different ways, but nobody was listening at the time. The slave trade went on. The African kingdoms sold the slaves, and the European kingdoms bought the slaves and brought them especially to their colonial world. The main port of entry in the Iberian world of the portion of the New World was through Cartagena. What do you do in response to something like this, where the powers of the world will continue to do whatever they do without responding to the voices of the papacy or of others? What do you do in the face of such a horrible institution? And here I think it's important to cite the example of St. Peter Clover. So St. Peter Clover was a Jesuit who lived 1581 to 1654, and he swore that he would be a slave to the blacks forever. And what did he do? He ministered to the Africans at the port of entry in Cartagena. He offered them comfort, care, a meal, and the faith if they were willing, and possibly baptized them. By some counts, it may be that he baptized over 300,000 of these African slaves as they came into the colonial Americas. Peter Clover was despised by the colonial authorities, and he was frequently despised by the Africans themselves because he was one of the other on the part of the Africans. What can you do? He's just one man, he's just one priest, one missionary. He couldn't move the needle on the institutional structures around slavery. He couldn't get the colonials to give up what they were doing. Instead, he did what was most important, which he offered the maximum amount of the gospel that he could in a dark situation. And there, I think this is important, especially to recognize when dealing with the legacy of these missionaries and of these saints, that whatever we might say in our own present age and in whatever version of morality we think we have right now and the desire to judge the past, we have to recognize that these missionaries, they did great things within their context. Regardless of how awful their context was, they tried to make the gospel grow through their words, through their deeds, and through their actions. And whether it's Peter Clover or Junipero Serra or many of these other figures, I think we need to recognize that what was going on in many cases by the colonial authorities was a horrible thing. But then we also need to recognize the courage to speak truth to power in this case. And more importantly than speak truth to power, to speak gospel to power, to speak the gospel, to speak the message of the city of God to the actions and the deeds of the city of man in this particular situation. And I think one of the most important things about figures like Peter Clover is they don't really care about legacy. They cared about being saints at their own time. And I think that can be a useful way of thinking through some of the difficulties and the pain around the realities of European conquest and colonization, mixed with the introduction and spread of Christianity to new places and to new peoples. The Spanish keep on pushing south, and this will eventually lead to the conquest of the Incan Empire along the Andes Mountains, and they will establish themselves primarily around Lima, and they will do the similar strategies. New villages will be established, they will ferret out idols, they will try to use the rigors of the law and the Inquisition to make sure that the natives follow the Christian moral code. And so much of the same policy that was used in the Viceroyalty of New Spain will be used in New Granada and Peru as well, as the Spanish continue to consolidate their gains. One of the things we need to say about the difficulties of being a missionary before we turn our attentions to the Jesuit policies. One of the difficulties about being a missionary in a new place like this, especially as a Catholic missionary, is that you have to learn the language of the people. Why? And that's because of confession. So much of what we know about the vernacular of many of these natives is because the friars and the Jesuits recorded these languages and learned these languages, not only so they could speak to the people, but definitely so that they could hear confessions, because you don't really want to do confession with an interpreter. So this is an indication of one of the most significant differences, so to speak, of Catholic missiology versus the emergence of Protestant missiology. You know, Protestant missiology, particularly in the 20th century, is just go in, translate the Bible into the vernacular, preach a few times, leave them the Bible, and then move on. But Catholic missiology, because it requires inserting people into the sacramental life of the church, requires not only the robust linguistic skills, but literally the ability to interact with people on an individual level. Yes, in the confessional, but in a much more intimate way. The building in stone in part of these new missions is a sign of the permanence of Catholic missiology. It's not just throw out the gospel and hope it has good effect. It's about settling down with people and helping them to live the gospel. And we'll return to some of these thoughts when we talk about the missions in the East. The Jesuits began in earnest as missionaries in about mid-16th century. They established a college in Mexico City in 1570, and they went north into present-day Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, establishing missions. Figures like Eusebio Kino were just on fire to establish missions and to baptize. Brazil was a Portuguese possession, and so much of the conversion of Brazil, what we think of as Brazil, was run by friars from Portugal or by Jesuits launching from Portugal. The Jesuits had a favored method when it came to converting populations in the New World, and these were the Jesuit reductions. So reductions were territories that were directly under the authority of the crown, be it Portuguese or Spanish, and that the colonials could in no way interfere with these reductions. They're basically kingdoms for the natives under the protection of the crown and run by the Jesuits. Yes, there is paternalism here. The reductions kind of treated the population like children, like slowly teaching them how to be self-autonomous, but they nevertheless were used to protect the natives from the colonials. And some of the things that they would do in here was not just teach them the faith, but they would also teach culture. Classical musical education was even done. There were Jesuit native operas that were composed and performed at this time. There would be symphonies combining European and native instruments going on during this period. The most famous of all of these reductions is the Guarani, and the Jesuits relocated natives from the edges of Portuguese and Spanish authorities not far from Uruguay, modern-day Uruguay, in order to protect the natives from those colonial authorities. It's really the success of this Guarani kingdom, which is why the Jesuits would be hated by the Portuguese authorities, because here was a big chunk of territory that the Portuguese and the Spanish crowns want to get their hands on, and that will play an important part for the dissolution of the monasteries. Once the Jesuits were expelled, it seems that the community didn't have enough experienced leadership with dealing especially with the crowns, and so the reductions will be dissolved as well. The Jesuits will use these reductions in Canada and in lots of other places that they go. There are examples of the fruits of this conversion period. I know I've been maybe talking a lot about the gloom, but there's lots of saints that emerge in this period. There's obviously Juan Diego and his encounter with Our Lady of Guadalupe, which we've already talked about before, which would become a sense of not only lead to conversions in New Spain, but would lead to a new identity on the part of the people of New Spain. Even to this day, you can have people who from Mexico who would say that although they're not Catholic, they are still Guadalupan in their attitudes. But there are other fruits you can look at, and just to give two examples of saints of New Spain, the realities of this world affect one of these more than the other. Rose of Lima, she's a beata, which is kind of like an anchoress, and she could have lived this life anywhere in all of Catholic Europe. Her intense asceticism was, while attached to a parish, she could have been a beata in Madrid just as well as she's a beata in Lima. What is different, however, is that Rose of Lima gave her self-inflicted mortifications, her intense asceticism, was not just for her, but she was offering it up as a way to, for the sake of the idolatry of her land, to turn her people from idolatry. Martin de Porres, is the son of an African mother and a Spanish colonial, and this means that the Spanish pure blood laws apply to him, and that means he can't become a Dominican even though he has a great love of the poor and he's intelligent and learned great skills by studying with a barber. Nevertheless, the best he could do was become a servant to a Dominican house in Lima during his lifetime. Eventually, however, his holiness and his skills in medicine would be acknowledged, and eventually he would be able to become a full member of the Dominicans and would end up in charge of the infirmary, and there miraculous healings occurred. So he was at once a mystic, and he was also a great lover of the poor and the outcast. But you can see in the difficulties of the life of Martin de Porres the impact of this, the reality of the Spanish conquest and the long legacy of the pure blood laws, and that Spanish identity is firmly built on Catholicism, but with a deep suspicion of conversion to Catholicism. So what we've been talking about so far, we can see some patterns in how the missions were conducted in the West, and this I call the Iberian model. The Iberian model says that in order to be fully Christian, in order to be fully Catholic, you're going to have to become more European. You're going to have to become more Spanish. The kind of most visible proof of this is the language that is spoken in all of these regions. There are no native languages spoken collectively. The language of all of these regions are the European languages, especially of Spanish and Portuguese, with a little bit of French mixed in here and everywhere, closer to the Caribbean. So the Iberian model, we can see, coincides with the process of colonization. It is a factor of colonization, right? So the Mexico City has a church built right in the very center. So the promotion of the faith as part of Spanish identity makes the spread of the faith coincide with colonization, but we can also see that the friars fought the most savage aspects of colonization right from the very get-go. The Iberian model is a highly paternalistic model that we can see within the Western missions, in that initially we want to get people to have external conformity to the faith and to adopt the physical symbols and the morality, and then through the process of visitations and inquisition, we will start to improve and double check on the quality of the converts, but sort of full participation in the life of the church, meaning especially native clergy, will have to wait until the natives have achieved a level of Europeanness in their culture in this idea. Another aspect we can see of the Iberian model is that it's controversial in that it sees the other cultures as cultures to be defeated and not cultures to be assimilated. And this is particularly true in the Aztec world. So that is the Iberian model, which will be in operation at the same time as the other model I will discuss, which is the Jesuit model. But this one needs to be kept in mind always as an operative missiology, so to speak, of the Age of Discovery. But I don't want to end this lecture without emphasizing how deeply holy and heroic were these missionaries to leave their homelands and the comforts of where they were, to go to people and to give the faith to them, knowing full well that they could be killed while trying to spread the gospel, despite whatever protections may have come from the colonial infrastructure. And this indeed did happen in the 16th and into the 17th century. These missions become an important source of identity and morale boosts for people back home in Europe, and this morale boost and identity leads to the production of more missionaries. It creates this missionary feedback loop, so to speak. And you can get the importance of this comes across very clear with Peter Canisius's quotation here, which is, "You will read in these letters about your brothers' most gallant struggles, about their burning zeal, their undefeatable labors, their apostolic faith, their neighborly charity, so great as hardly to be believed. I shall be surprised indeed if you can read the story of such a wonderful and perfect doing without profit to your souls." The stories of the missionaries, the story of Isaac Jogues and other North American martyrs, the stories of what the friars accomplished in New Spain, these stories are collected, they are printed, often in the vernacular, and they are distributed across the Catholic world. And this leads to an edification of the faith, but it also leads to more people wanting to take up the missionary identity and to participate in the missionary life of the church. So heroic missionary efforts should never be underestimated or forgotten in all of this. There were men that put their lives at great risk so that they could spread the gospel, but they did it in a very complicated world full of light and darkness. And that's part of the legacy of the conversion of the Western world. Thank you.